Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are joining us from. We appreciate that you managed to join us today for yet another session of this webinar series. We are so happy to have you here, though only virtually. It's great that we have so many familiar names and faces, at least we've seen some, and I hope that you enjoy today's session. My name is Johnson Kansime. I am a doctoral researcher here at the Leibniz Institute of Agricultural Development in Transition Economies, IAMO, located in Halle-Saale here in Germany. For more than half a year now, I have had the honor to be part of the Leibniz Junior Research Group, RuWell, which stands for Rural Wellbeing in Transition, Multidimensional Drivers, and their effects on immobility. The project is funded by the Leibniz Association for a period of 5 years. The main objective of this project is to develop a multidimensional well-being index with a special focus on place attachment, which we then link to immobility decisions of populations in rural East Germany and Southeast Europe. With this, we envision policy salient findings that can hopefully fit into the broad arena of discussions aiming at improving the quality of life and the livability of people living in rural areas. Since our project is still at an early stage, we thought ourselves that we can organize this small series of webinars to have an opportunity to engage, discuss, and get inspired by other researchers in this field. And today's session is our second of this kind. Yesterday's session with Talita Grayling being our first. Today, Professor Koen Decancq will talk about measuring well-being with great insights from Belgium and his work that he's doing. I want to encourage you throughout the webinar to actively participate, kindly ask questions, share your thoughts, or seek clarification by using the chat feature. We will address as many questions as possible during the Q&A session. In the Q&A session, of course, you have the opportunity to raise and ask by unmuting your microphone. And if you want, switch on your camera. Koen will talk for just about 30 to 40 minutes. And this, after that, we will have to discuss until 5 p.m. I'll now, without further ado, introduce our presenter today. Professor Koen Decancq is a professor at Herman de Lenck Center for Social Policy of the University of Antwerp, a research fellow at the London School of Economics, UC Leuven, and the Department of Economics at KU Leuven. His research focuses on the multidimensional measurement of inequality, poverty, and well-being, with a special focus on the incorporation of different preferences and the role of socioeconomic well-being and aging policies. Koen is an associate editor at the Journal of Social Choice and Welfare and the Journal of Economic Inequality. He is a member also of the editorial board at the Journal of Review of Income and Wealth. Koen is the spokesperson and country team leader of the Survey of Health, Aging and Retirement in Europe, also known as SHARE Flanders. Over the past years, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Koen has been active in investigating how inequality, poverty, and well-being can be measured within a multidimensional context, and his work has been published in several journals. He has authored and co-authored a wide range of publications, among others, the book titled Well-being in Belgium, Beyond Happiness and Income. It's freely available. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Koen Decancq. Over to you, Koen.
Thanks a lot for this super kind introduction, Johnson. I'm going to do the hardest part, trying to share my presentation, and then let's see whether that works. Do you see my presentation?
Not yet, but not the entire screen.
Not properly.
Yeah. Could you share in presentation mode?
Is this better?
No, we are now seeing your desktop, I think.
Let me try this. Is this better?
Yes,
yeah, super.
Perfect.
Okay. So Well, let me start by thanking you all for being here and for spending a beautiful Wednesday afternoon listening to me. I'm very happy to be here, and I regret a bit that I'm not there physically with you, but yeah, that's how it goes at the end of the academic year. When I was invited to give this talk, I was doubting between either giving a, let's say, a one-paper presentation and go in depth into one paper, or to give more a broader overview of a research agenda. And I thought that from the perspective of your project, maybe the second was more useful. So that's what I'm going to do, but I will give references to, let's say, the more detailed work. And of course, I'm very happy to address more detailed questions in the Q&A. So sorry for rushing here and there or being, let's say, overly superficial. You will ask me in the Q&A where that's necessary to be more in depth and in detail. So let me try to go to the next slide. Well, that seems not to, okay. So let me start by saying something which I think is very important when we talk about well-being and about well-being measurement, is that I think it's really essential and crucial to be clear and precise about the motivation why we are talking about well-being, why we want to measure well-being. And let me try to be clear on that myself. So I have a policy perspective. So I am interested in well-being because I'm interested in social policies, in policies, for instance, policies that deal with progress at the individual level. If you want to say something about whether people have a better life now than they had in the past, or due to a certain policy that was implemented, of course, it's essential to have a tool that allows you to make within a person a comparison of well-being. At the same time, if you are, let's say, inspired by a Rawlsian perspective on political philosophy, and you want to have policies that focus on the worse off in a society, obviously you need a tool that allows you to identify who are the worse off. And for that, you need a measure that allows you to compare the well-being of different people. Another example would be if you want to measure inequality. If you want to measure inequality, somehow you have to face Amartya Sen's question. Yes, but equality of what? What equality are we interested in? What's the metric or the space in which we want to study inequality? And then well-being would be my answer to Sen's question. So well-being for me is quite an instrumental concept, a concept that I need to talk about interpersonal comparisons in a policy context. So which might be a little bit different from, for instance, a philosopher or a psychologist who is interested in studying well-being per se. I'm studying in well-being with the goal of saying something about policy and for policy design or policy evaluation. So I think that is quite important. And as a starting points for my, let's say, policy-oriented view on well-being, let me take two starting points. First of all, my starting point would be that well-being is a multidimensional notion, right? That there is several dimensions that are important for well-being, if we want to use it in policy, so that we cannot reduce this interpersonal well-being comparisons to just a comparison along one dimension. And that obviously, if you move to a multidimensional framework, makes the question more exciting and also more challenging, because I mean, it's very well possible that you are better in one dimension and that I'm better in another dimension. And if I now want to give my scarce resources to the worse off, I mean, it becomes challenging to know whether the scarce resources should go to you or to me. So that's the kind of problems that we are interested in addressing. So that's my first starting point, multidimensionality. And the second starting point is the view that if we want to somehow aggregate these different dimensions of life, that people have different opinions on what is most important in life. And I think we all have examples in our, let's say, close environment of people who give more importance to certain aspects of life, whereas other people say, no, that's not important in life. There's different other aspects that are much more important. So I've learned that there's also non-economists in the virtual room, which is fantastic, I think. in the economic jargon, we refer to this, let's say, perspective on what is important in life. We call that a preference. And I'm also going to do that. So when I say that people might have different preferences, if you're not familiar or very keen with me using the word preferences, you can replace that by a perspective, an informed perspective on what is important in life. And I will be much more precise, I hope, in the next few slides on what exactly this preference may entail. So I think that is the broad question that I have in mind, and that's what I want to talk about today. But this is also, let's say, the broad underlying question for my research agenda, and also for the research agenda of many other colleagues and friends, is the question now, how can we, in such a multidimensional framework, make well-being comparisons, measure well-being, when we also want to acknowledge that people might have different preferences, that you might care more, let's say, about health, whereas I might care more about income. So how can we do that? How should we do that? That's the set of questions that I want to say something about today. I chose a slightly weird title to talk about well-being research in Belgium. So when I was preparing this presentation, it occurred to me that, in fact, many of the things that I wanted to talk about somehow are based, have connections with Belgium, because either they are done by Belgian researchers or they're using Belgian data. So that's why I chose that maybe slightly weird title. Of course, I'm not wanting to say at all that there's no other interesting well-being research in the rest of the world. And certainly there's very interesting well-being research also in Germany being carried out and will be. But I want to talk about the work of 4 research teams that I know quite well. This is a research team in Antwerp, where I'm based, a research team in Leuven, which is another city in Belgium, in Brussels, and in Louvain-la-Neuve. And the nice thing is that we had a few large-scale collaborative projects together. So a project that I want to talk about is the MEQIN project. Weird abbreviation, stands for Measuring Equivalent Incomes. I'm going to talk more about equivalent incomes in a second. And the book that also Johnson was referring to, that's the one of which you see the cover here on the slide. That's the book that we in fact wrote at the end of that project. And I'm going to talk a lot about this MEQIN teamwork and also the MEQIN data that we collected in that project. In fact, there was a follow-up project that I'm going to address at the end of my talk. That's the IWA-B project. I'm going to say more about that at the end. But that's a project with the same team, more or less, of the 4 universities that you see listed on the slide. So I want to talk about the research in Belgium on, let's say, measuring well-being. And I thought it was useful to do that in 3 steps, and let us call that the 3 generations of well-being research in Belgium. So the first generation, I think, would be purely theoretical studies on the measurement of well-being. Typically, these are axiomatic social choice oriented studies about how we can measure well-being without bothering at all about empirical application, about applying this, about data. This is pure theory. So that would be the first generation. I'm going to start by saying a couple of things about that, and then I move to the second generation. I think I'm most going to talk about that. When we want to bring these theoretical insights to the data, but we allow ourselves to be quite naive on the kind of preferences people have. We assume basically that they have textbook, microeconomics textbook standard preferences, which have all the regularity assumptions that we typically impose on preferences, for instance, completeness. And then I think the third generation of the work that we have been doing and are currently doing in Belgium is to relax that latter assumption, to say, well, what happens if we take the challenges that behavioral economics throws at us seriously and realize that people in the real world actually don't have standard preferences in their head. They have real world preferences. How does that change the theory? How can we measure, and so on and so forth? So that would be the third generation of studies. So that's a bit also the structure of my talk. The first generation, and I'm going to refer a little bit to the work that I'm showing you here. I mean, I'm just showing you that because then you have the references. And I also wanted to highlight, I mean, if you look at the 3 references I'm showing, the central person in many of the work is Marc Fleurbet. Marc Fleurbet is not a Belgian, he's French, worked a lot with Belgians, also stayed quite a while in Belgium. And I think if you're seeking an introduction to, let's say, the theory, the book in the middle is really a very good introduction, which was the book that Marc wrote based on his own notes that he prepared for the Stiglitz committee, that also made it into a Journal of Economic Literature survey. So if you want to have the short version, you can start with that paper there. If I'm a bit vague on the references, please drop me an email later. I'm very happy to provide a more precise reference later on. So I think it's useful to also put things a little bit in context and to say very shortly something about 3 main approaches that I see how we can measure well-being, multidimensional well-being. And the first approach would be what I would call an objective approach. An objective approach would be an approach in which, as a researcher, we measure the outcomes of individuals in several dimensions of life, say, for instance, income, health, and education. And then we have some mathematical formula, let's say some kind of a weighted average or something more sophisticated, by which we compute a well-being. The Human Development Index can be an example of that. Also, the Better Life Index of the OECD can be an example of such an objective approach. Of course, the objective approach can be criticized by people who say, yeah, but I mean, where does the formula come from? I mean, what does that have to do with well-being? If we use such an objective approach, it can very well be that we have policies that on paper lead to more objective well-being, but that people don't think or don't consider to be improving their own well-being. So there might be a disconnect between what people think is improving their own well-being and what this objective approach argues that improves well-being. So that will be the first type of objective approaches. On the other side of the spectrum, you have the subjective approaches, which say, well, we don't have to have such a complicated or simple mathematical formula to compute well-being. No, let's just ask the people. Have a subjective, we ask people to have a subjective evaluation of their own well-being, and we ask people, for instance, by a very simple standard life satisfaction question. I mean, on a scale between 0 and 10, how satisfied are you with your life? And then we can use that in our analysis of well-being. And remember that I took a policy perspective from the start. So that, of course, might be criticized, such an approach, by people who say, but yeah, we all know that people in very bad objective situations might adapt to that situation. Sam gave famous examples along these lines. And that might, you might argue that that makes such a subjective approach maybe not so very convenient for, or not very appealing ethically for policy evaluations, because we would argue that people who have live in objective bad conditions, but are able to adapt to that situation, in fact, do not require our scarce resources, will not be identified as the worse off because they have this adaptation ability. Let's say a bit the mirror image of this argument would be that there is expensive tastes, or if you take it from a more, let's say, survey methodology perspective, you might just simply say, yeah, Koen, but I mean, how are we going to make policy based on such a subjective approach? I mean, how do you know that your 7 is comparable to Antje's 7, for instance? So, I mean, these are all more or less similar type of arguments that maybe the subjective approach might be too subjective, again, from a policy perspective. And then the approach that I'm going to talk about today is what I would call a preference-based approach, which is somewhere in between, which takes the objective outcomes as an input, but rather than using an arbitrary, mysterious, mystical mathematical aggregation procedure, uses the preferences of the individuals themselves to aggregate that and to come to a measure of well-being. And equivalent incomes is an example of that, and I'm going to highlight how that works in my next slide. What's the challenge here? Of course, the challenge is that you need to know much more. if you want to measure my well-being with such a preference-based approach, I mean, it's obvious that you do not only need to know how well I score in the different dimensions of life, but also you need to know my preferences. And that's an extra and quite challenging piece of information that we need to know if we want to operationalize that. And that's what I'm going to talk about in part 2 and part 3 of my talk. But first, I mean, how does equivalent income work? Let me illustrate that graphically. So I just do it with a graph in 2 dimensions, but I mean, obviously this can be generalized to a real multidimensional framework. And I use income and health as dimensions, but health might be replaced by any other non-income dimension that you are considering to be important: social interactions, education, job satisfaction, whatever you think is of importance in life, right? So how does it work? So this is an individual. For instance, this is Anne. Anne is a rich person. You see, she scores well on the income dimension, but she's unhealthy. She scores low on the health dimension. And now this curve, which we call an indifference curve, such a curve reflects the view of Anne on the good life. So what this curve does is it connects several points in the space that Anne considers with her view on the good life equally good as her own value, right? The colored or the gray scaled points which are above the indifference curve, these are the points which we call are in the upper contour set. They are better. So if Anne moves to one of these points, she thinks that her life has improved with her view on the good life. If she moves to one of the white points below the curve, then she considers her life to have worsened. So that's already quite useful if we want to say something about intrapersonal comparisons of Anne over time. But of course, for most applications, we're also interested in making comparisons between 2 individuals, say between Anne and Bob. Bob is now appearing on the graph, if all goes well, and Bob is poorer, but is more in a better health. So now the question is, who is better off, right? Is it Anne or is it Bob? I have just €1 to give to the worse off. Am I going to give it to Anne, who is in poor health, or am I going to give it to Bob, who is poor income-wise? Before, let's say, tackling that question, let us realize that also Bob might have a view on the good life, and that's captured by his red indifference curve. And well, for people whose microeconomics is still fresh, we see that the indifference curves cross. So that means that Anne and Bob have a different indifference map, so they have a different view on the good life. They disagree on what is relatively more important in life. Anne considers income more important. Bob considers health more important. Now, what's the trick? What's the trick that is used to measure well-being and to come to interpersonal comparisons based on equivalent incomes? That would be to define a reference situation. And that reference situation here in my example could be, for instance, perfect health. Think of perfect health as a situation in which you have no health problems. So if you have a back pain today, imagine a situation in which the back pain would have gone, right? That would be a situation of perfect health. All the health issues are gone. And let's say the normative underlying ethical or philosophical perspective of the equivalent income approach to measure well-being would be to say, imagine that people would be in a situation in which the non-income dimensions are on that reference situation, on this perfect level. Imagine that Anne and Bob both would be in perfect health. Would then it not be justified to compare them based on their income? Right? So if the answer is yes, if you say, well, that's quite an appealing idea, if everybody would be in this, let's say, fantastic world where there would be no problems in the non-income dimensions, everybody would have perfect health, the education level he or she aspires to, the social relations that she wants, and so on and so forth. If we would all be in that situation, well, then we can say that the poorer individual would be the one who is worse off. And that's exactly what is going on in the measurement of equivalent income. So what are we doing? We are asking Anne and Bob to put themselves on this reference line of perfect health, right? And we do that, and they do that by using their indifference curve. So Anne, for instance, she's indifferent between being in the fully colored point where she actually is, or in the white the light white, you know the point that I'm referring to, the point on that is the intersection with the reference situation, the gray dotted line. She's indifferent between those two because they're on her indifference curve. For Bob, the same. Bob is indifferent between the fully red dot or the empty red dot. And of course, if we now have these two situations of Anne and Bob, now we can compare them because we are in this counterfactual world where everything non-income is at the perfect level. And that's the equivalent income, right? So the idea is in fact very simple. You walk along the indifference curve until you reach that reference situation on which you, from an ethical perspective, argued and you say, well, now I can compare individuals. So that's the rough idea behind equivalent income. What's the theoretical contributions that people have made, and I've also contributed a little bit to that literature, is to study with axiomatic theory. I mean, what are the axioms that this measure satisfy? How do we come to this measure or to related other measures such as ray utility? I'm very happy to talk about that in the Q&A, but I think for the sake of the presentation, I think this is enough about the theory. I wanted to say one more thing. So I wanted to introduce one concept, and that's the concept of the willingness to pay. If you're a bit familiar with stated preference, that might be familiar to you. So the willingness to pay is in fact a difference between your actual income, the actual income of Anne, and her equivalent income, the situation with perfect health. So it's her willingness to pay for perfect health that is subtracted from her actual situation. And for Bob, we have the same. It's the difference between the actual income and the equivalent income of Bob. So that captures how much willingness to pay Bob has to be in that perfect health reference situation. So what are key ingredients if you want to measure that, if you want to implement that? If we move to, let's say, implementation, first of all, we have to know for Anne and Bob, where are they in the space? What is their income? What's their health? We have to have a theory or a choice, a normative choice for this reference value. What is the level of perfect health? And in fact, we have also theories developed where people have individual reference values, where your reference value might not be the same as mine. But again, in the Q&A, we can talk more about that. But what is most important is that if you want to implement that, we have to know the indifference map. We have to know what is this line through this indifference curve through the bundle of Anne that consists of all the points that she considers to be equally good. So that's what I want to talk about now, is how can we get that information about this indifference map? How can we understand what people find relatively more important in their life? Right, and that brings us to, let's say, the second generation of studies. Here again, there's, let's say, in the literature, one can think of three approaches. I think, obvious first approach would be to say, well, Koen, if you want to know equivalent incomes, and you don't observe it, just ask people. Ask Anne and Bob, I mean, if you were in perfect health, I mean, what would be the income level that makes you indifferent with your actual bundle, right? Immediately, if you think about raising such a question in your survey, you say, well, that's a quite challenging question, right? So that, I think, is one of the downsides of this approach. And I'm going to give an example on my next slides, I mean, how we have done that in Belgium. Hardcore economists would say, I mean, no, that's the wrong direction. Let's not do stated preferences, because if you are going to ask people something, I mean, they're going to lie to you. They're going to strategically respond, especially when you want to use that for policy. So don't do that. I mean, rely only on the behavior of people. And that would be an alternative track, would be based on revealed preferences, where we infer preferences from the actual behavior that the choices people make. But I think I'm not going to say much about that in this presentation, because I don't think that that is the way to go, because we are typically interested in measuring well-being, which consists of dimensions on which we don't make choices, right? My health is not, or it's not only a choice variable, right? My health is largely just a matter of luck. And the behavior basically only gives us a, let's say, very partial information about trade-offs that people have in their mind. Third approach would be a life satisfaction approach, in which we are going a little bit back to these subjective approaches that I was talking about in my previous, let's say, section. But we are going to use the life satisfaction data now to infer preferences. And I'm going to give an example of stated preferences and of this life satisfaction approach, and I'm going to highlight how we have implemented that in our MEQIN study, which is a study that we have carried out in 2016. Let me start with stated preferences. So this MEQIN study is a study, as I said, in 2016, we went into the field. We had almost 3 years of preparation, if I remember well, discussion of what we were going to ask, how we were going to ask, what the sampling was, and so on and so forth. And in the end, we have a sample of about 3,400 individuals. We measure many things, but one of the things we measure is their income. For this results, in fact, I'm going to rely on their consumption rather than their income, personal consumption, as a measure of, let's say, how of their score in the monetary dimension, right? So I'm going to talk about equivalent consumption, if you want, right? Well, I can talk more about that in the Q&A as well, how exactly we constructed personal consumption in our survey. We're also I'm going to focus here on the example income and health. And health is measured in MEQIN based on a battery of questions, a quite standard battery of questions, the so-called SF36, which are 36 questions that allow basically to map people's health in 5 dimensions, and then we aggregate these 5 dimensions in a health score. Now, remember what we want to do is we want to have a stated preference idea about this equivalent income. So we have somehow to communicate to our respondents this counterfactual scenario of perfect health, right? And how did we decide to do that? So individuals go through the survey, we ask their personal consumption, right? By asking several questions, we ask their health by the SF36, and then we visualize that. We show a graph, say, look, this is your consumption, this is your health, the 5 bar charts that give these 5 dimensions of health. And then we say, now, dear respondent, imagine that all your health variables would be at the maximal level. So we show a bar chart where all the health goes to 100%. Now, this scenario in which your health, all the scores are at the maximal, this is what we call the scenario of perfect health. And then we ask the individual, now, if you would be in that scenario, basically, with how much should we reduce your consumption such that the 2 scenarios, your actual scenario, the one that we have showed first with your actual consumption, your actual health, and your new scenario with this adjusted level of consumption and perfect health are equally good. Okay, you see, it's a quite challenging question to raise. I mean, we're not the first ones doing that. There were some other studies in France who have tried that before. And we obtain ultimately a willingness to pay. So remember, willingness to pay is how much people are willing to pay for an improvement on health. And here is expressed as an improvement for 1 point on the health scale. So the health scale is a score between 0 and 100. And for instance, suffering a chronic disease would be about 20 points on that scale. So that means that if we take a chronic disease away from somebody, that person would improve on the health scale 20 points. And the willingness to pay in terms of consumption, average consumption is, let's say, 1,200 euros, would be about 4.5 times 20, about 90 euros a month. So for 90 euros, that's basically what people are willing to give up if their chronic disease was gone away. Right? We can estimate in difference maps, and you can see here is an example for some social demographic groups, right? And we see basically with this method, the stated preference method, very, very flat indifference curves, right? And that's also what you were probably thinking when I was explaining our willingness to pay. So, I mean, that's ridiculously low, or maybe not ridiculously, but that's very, very low, right? So we obtain willingness to pay for health, which is very low. This might be because people think that that is not a question one should really be addressing, right? That trade-offs between health and income are somehow taboo. And we ask a little bit about that. If people, for instance, give like protest answers or answers that we interpret as protest answers, we ask about that. We ask, why did you have given that answer? But I think most often we find that people just find this counterfactual thinking actually very hard, right? So here is an alternative method, which was also implemented on this MEQIN data, and that's the life satisfaction approach, which is something that I worked on together with Erik Schokkaert from the University of Leuven, and again, Marc Fleurbet from Paris right now. At that time, Marc was in Princeton in our paper that was published in Economica. And basically, we show how you can infer indifference maps here from life satisfaction data. This effect is very simple. You just run a life satisfaction regression in which the dimensions of interest are factors explaining life satisfaction. And that gives you an idea about the marginal rates of substitution. But to do that, I mean, one thing is important is that you need to make a very heavy assumption. And that assumption is that life satisfaction data are in fact consistent with the preferences, this, remember, informed opinion that people have on what is most important in life. And this is really an assumption, right? It's an assumption that you either buy or don't buy. I mean, the more I work on it, the less I buy it, I think. But that's an assumption one needs to make, right? But as soon as you have estimated the coefficients on this regression, the betas and the gammas in particular, what you can do is you can quite easily compute equivalent incomes. You can look at the formula in the gray square at the bottom. Equivalent income is denoted y with a star. So the y star, or the logarithm of y star, is nothing else than the actual income of the person. And then what we subtract is the willingness to pay, and h bar is the reference health, that's perfect health, and hi is the actual health of the person. And then how much people care about the distance between actual health and perfect health, that's captured by what I've shown in red, the marginal rate of substitution, or the ratio between the two coefficients. Now, in terms of your project of looking at regional variation, what you could do, for instance, is interact these betas and gammas with dummies reflecting regions to capture how the marginal rates of substitution are different in different regions of Germany, in different regions of or different countries, right? And this is then what we use as explained variable, right? The life satisfaction scores. This is a very standard life satisfaction question. And in MEQIN, I mean, this is the 3,404 respondents. That's the distribution of their life satisfaction, which is very much in line with what we know about Belgian life satisfaction distributions. Overall, people give their life an 8. At least most people give their life an 8, on average, a little bit more than 7.6. Now, if we use this life satisfaction data to estimate willingness to pay or to estimate indifference maps, what we obtain is the blue curve. So the blue curve for a person which is in the black dot. And then you see that the willingness to pay, the difference between what you read on the vertical axis and the equivalent income, the intersection with 100, then you see that we find a very high willingness to pay. So what we have observed in our MEQIN data is that, sorry, what I forgot to say is the red curve is the one that we obtain with our contingent valuation exercise, the one that I described before. So what we obtained actually in the MEQIN study, in the end, after having spent a lot of work, and well, I should probably also admit taxpayers' money, is that willingness to pay is either with one method quite low, very low, or is very high, probably ridiculously high, because look at this individual who is not in such a bad health, right? His health is a level of 82, which would be about my health level probably. That person is willing to give up almost all his consumption, because remember, on the vertical axis there's consumption, right? Is somebody who consumes 600 is willing to give up almost all his consumption to improve this about 20 points on the health scale. Yeah, I said that. So basically what we learned from MEQIN was willingness to pay is either very low or very high with the two methods. We were having a bit, quite an unsatisfied feeling about this, is that, look, I mean, these methods yeah, this is probably not the last and final answer on this question. And that was what was bringing us to, let's say, the third generation of work is, on the one hand, let's say, a dissatisfaction with how the two methods that we were implementing led to very different results, right? Probably a lower bound and an upper bound on the number that we more or less thought was reasonable. And at the same time, an unsatisfactory feeling is that, look, we are probably assuming here a lot about preferences. We are assuming very nice and well-behaved indifference maps. And maybe people don't have such nice, well-behaved indifference maps. And one of the challenges from behavioral economics that we wanted to take on board is the fact that maybe preferences of people are not necessarily complete. That it might be that people just sometimes don't know. If you ask them to compare their life to a hypothetical life, is maybe people don't know, right? And in terms, well, and that basically brought us these two things, so both the unsatisfaction with how the results diverged between contingent valuation and life satisfaction on the one hand, and the fact that we wanted to relax the assumptions that we imposed on the preferences, that brought us to what we called at a certain point the adaptive bisectional dichotomous choice method. And that's what I want to talk about still, if I still have, let's say, a little bit more than 5 minutes, and then I'm all yours for questions. So I want to say something about this ABDC method, but let me first say something about this incompleteness. So this incompleteness that people have in their mind, how this is reflected in the graph would be that in between the upper contour, the points which people think are better than their own life, right? And the lower contour, the points that people consider to be worse compared to their own life, there might be points that people just don't know. And that's what happens between the two curves that I've shown you. And here I've shown you, and you will see on the next slide why I've done that. I have shown you a quite narrow area of I don't know, but this might be very much larger of people who really have not thought very hard about this kind of questions in the past, or who really have very incomplete preferences. So this might be much larger in reality. How does this ABDC method work? In fact, I think it's very simple, and it's also quite nicely implemented in an online survey. So how does it work? We start with the point that is indicated, which is a person with a non-monetary aspect. We called it health before and income. And we ask that person to compare her own bundle, her own outcomes with a counterfactual. And the counterfactual is constructed in such a way that her income is halved. You may not see that, but it is halfway the income level that she actually has. And her non-monetary aspect, her health, is perfect. So that's why we call it a bisectional method. We halve the income and we ask her to compare that to perfect health. And now what the person is doing is just comparing two lives, her actual life or a life in which she would have half of her income, but no health problems. And I think that that probably is one of the, it remains a hard question, but it's much easier to communicate to non-trained economists than this compared to this contingent valuation question that I've just shown you before. Now, if this is the person and what is in dotted blue lines is what we do not know but want to observe, right? We know that this person, facing this choice between these two dots, she will say, well, the counterfactual dot is better because that dot, the red one, is in her upper contour, is in the points that she considers to be better. As soon as she tells us that the counterfactual life is the better one, we know something about that person. We know that this indifference area, or the non-comparable set, I should say, right? So the area that we're looking for, the thick indifference curve, loosely speaking, that must be below the red dot, right? Because she has told us, I prefer the red dot. Once we know that, we can do the bisectional trick once more, and we can halve again by asking now a new comparison, dichotomous choice, again, your own life and a new life, the new red dot, which is halfway between where we were before. and 0, right? Now the person looks at, again, this comparison between her actual life and the new red dot, and she said, well, that red dot is in my lower contour set. That's worse because it's below my curves, right? So she tells me, no, give me my actual life. And now we know that what we want to note is indifference, the thick indifference curve is somewhere between the white and the red dot. So we can half again. And we do that in the third round of the module. And then we ask the new red dot, right? And again, the person is going to say, the counterfactual one is better, right? Because it's in my upper contour. And by doing that step by step, we get always closer and closer to what we actually want to know, this area of this intersection between this non-comparable set, the thick indifference curve, if you want, and the reference situation. In this case, the person we are asking something in the non-comparable set, and the person is going to say, I don't know. Okay, so in this questionnaire, we explicitly give the person the option to say, I don't know, dear researchers, I really don't know. I don't want to answer that. I don't want to think about it. Leave me alone. Okay. And then we get not to a point estimate of the equivalent income, but we get to a range, which in most cases have tried that, in most cases is in fact quite narrow. This is the reference again to this ABDC method, was published a couple of years ago in the European Economic Review for people who want to read more about it. But again, I'm very happy to answer also questions bilaterally afterwards. Now, final 2 minutes, if I'm allowed, Mr. Chairman. I think
you're allowed. You're allowed, yeah.
Thank you, very kind. So last 2-3 minutes, I want to spend on a project that I am doing, in fact, with a PhD student of mine, with Santi Burone, who's based in Antwerp, and we have collected data to compare the 3 methods that I have been talking about in this talk. So contingent valuation, life satisfaction, and this ABDC. And we did that based on data that we have collected in the LIS survey, and the LIS survey is I think a very high quality online survey, representative online survey in the Netherlands, right? They're quite expensive, I must say, but they're also it's a very rich data set by now. It's a very rich panel, and we just bought survey time in that panel to do this ABDC machinery. And we bought, in the end, something like 2,200 respondents. Here we look at an example of 3 dimensions: income, health, and social relations, because this was very much inspired by the, let's say, COVID and the post-COVID trade-offs that people had to make in the COVID period between income, health, and social relations and lockdowns and so on. And then we wanted to implement these 3 methods. For the life satisfaction method, we just have to run a life satisfaction regression with life satisfaction as explained variable, income, health, and social relations as explanatory variables, and then let's say the usual suspects to control our life satisfaction in our life satisfaction regression. And that's what we can do based on the main survey. So that's we can do for all these respondents. The ABDC, in fact, we did a little bit of an experiment. Most of our respondents only got the ABDC, but some of them got the contingent valuation either before or after. I'm not going to say that much about it in this, let's say, fast and furious presentation, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about group C, in which the contingent valuation was before the ABDC. And I'm going to compare those results to group A and B, who had the ABDC method without being contaminated by the contingent valuation, which either comes after or doesn't come at all. Maybe it's useful for you, if you're still in the design phase, implementing the ABDC to get to a quite narrow understanding of the equivalent income of individuals takes less than 90 seconds. So it goes very quickly. Once people understand that, they just have to compare these 2 lives. I mean, it's just clicking, and it's very quick. So final slide is a slide with the results of these comparisons. So what you see in, I'm colorblind, so I should be very careful with referring to the colors, but in the most left-hand box plot, that's a distribution of incomes, right? So you see it's about a median of 1,500 euros. That's data that we obtain from the LIS survey. And then we implement the ABDC and we ask for equivalent income in perfect health and with perfect social relations, right? And then we obtain the second box plot, the reddish one, right? And the difference between the two, that's the willingness to pay. All right, so we see that there is a positive willingness to pay to be in perfect health and to have, let's say, the perfect level of social interactions. That's the ABDC method. We can compare that to the life satisfaction method. And this is the results for the life satisfaction method. As with the MEQIN data that I've shown you, we see that the willingness to pay is very large, right? To the extent that the equivalent incomes, which is, after all, the income, the most left-hand results in the graph, right? From that, we subtract the willingness to pay, which is very large. In the end, the equivalent income, what we obtain, is very low. For many people, it is very close to zero, right? That's what we find in the green box plot, very low equivalent incomes. In fact, the levels are very low. The comparison in, let's say, in ordinal terms, if you want to focus, let's say, on the 10% worse off, the results are less different, right? So I'm not going to say that it's the same individuals who are at the bottom in the ABDC method and in the green life satisfaction method, but the overlap is quite substantial. And then we can also do the contingent valuation. Here, the caveat applies that, in fact, this is just 200 respondents, so it's a very small sample, whereas the other samples are larger, 10 times larger, about 2,000 respondents. And what we find here is, again, in line with what we found with the MEQIN earlier, is that the willingness to pay is very small. Is very small, such that the equivalent incomes are very much, the level is very much comparable to the original incomes, what you see at the left. You see that the box plot at the left and the right are not that different. And the difference that you see, the small difference, that's the willingness to pay elicited through the contingent valuation. So I want to give time also to the Q&A. So I want to conclude and wrap up, and let me do that by putting my first slide in the reverse order. So that was the question, right? I don't think that I have an answer to that question, but I think that we have already learned some things and that we have made some progress and that there's a lot of work to be done. And that's why I'm so excited also to be here. My first starting point was that it is important to have a multidimensional perspective. And I really believe that that is very important, right? Is that we start collecting data which is multidimensional in nature. And of course, I mean, that entails a trade-off, right? We have very good specialized income surveys. We have very good specialized health surveys. We have very good specialized housing surveys. But we have very few surveys which combine these things, right? Which have both incomes and health and housing and social interactions. And of course, you cannot ask everything to a respondent at once. It takes time, it has a cost. So we have to make a trade-off between the depth in each of a dimension and the broadness across dimensions. And I think there's really room for good surveys that have a broader, but then of course, inevitably less deep coverage of the different dimensions. So if that is what you want to do, I'm a great fan. If you were convinced or intrigued or just you somewhat liked this perspective of using preferences, then I think I've sketched a little bit where this research agenda, in my view, is right now. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. We are learning that eliciting preferences is quite challenging and quite hard, and that several methods lead to several results. But I think now what we have to try to understand is how it comes that different methods lead to different results, such that we can understand that better. And this is really an ongoing research agenda. And to come back to my slightly ridiculous title, of course, that research agenda is way beyond just a Belgian focus. Okay, that was what I wanted to tell to you, and I'm very much looking forward by stopping to talk, because this really feels like talking to an answering machine for an hour. So shoot your questions, please.
Thank you very much, Koen, for the captivating presentation. Very inspiring insights that you throw to us. And ladies and gentlemen, we can now have the question and answer session. If you have any questions, kindly raise your virtual hand and ask a question to Koen. Yes, Chair, the floor is yours.
Maybe I take the opportunity to ask the first question. Thank you very much, first of all, for this great talk. I'm very inspired, and yeah. But I have a question regarding actually the first thing you said in your presentation and what the outcome now is of your measure that you developed. So you said you think refer to Zen, that the aim should be like equality of well-being among regions, for example. Yeah, that should be a political aim, if I understood you correctly. And then you have, like, with your measurement of well-being, regional variation in terms of different willingness to pay for health, for example. Yeah, so in one region, they want to pay more for better health, and in another region, they want to pay less. But what does it mean now in practical terms? What would you recommend to politicians if, so my question is, wouldn't that be unfair to distribute the resources equally? So wouldn't it mean, yeah, wouldn't this mean you have to distribute whatever money unequally? Does the other one region get more than the other one just because they have different preferences? Should that be the aim?
Well, that's the question for you. That's a normative, that's an ethical question. I mean, my view is that as soon as you move to a multidimensional framework, you have to figure out trade-offs. And you can say, well, the trade-offs should be the same for everybody. But then if we're in a world, and I mean, I'm living in Belgium, right, where different regions have very different views on what priorities are and what is most important in life, not taking that into account, that's also an ethical choice, right? So I don't think that there is but that's an ethical question. And I think that not doing it is somehow paternalistic, right? If we say we are going to imagine that we have a hypothetical country where the North has particular views and the South has different views, I mean, not to use the East-West for Germany, right? Not using their own preferences, but using some kind of an averaged preference would mean that you are implementing in the North policies which could go against their preferences. Meaning that you say we're enhancing policies, we are enhancing well-being by this and these policies, but all the people in the North say, yeah, no, this is not enhancing well-being, right? I mean, there might be even a unanimous agreement that what the government is doing is wasteful in terms of well-being, right? And it might be the same in the South, right? So it might be, I mean, it can be a contrived example, but that's how social choice reasoning works, right? Is you can easily think of unanimous agreement of all people in the North, all people in the South saying, this policy is reducing my well-being, right? By using such a common set of references.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Koen, for the response. I see that we have a hand from Thomas Hasfield. Granted, Thomas?
Yeah, okay, thank you. I have a follow-up question, or maybe I see just I'm one colleague from Yamo. And though I fully understand that you want to start from the people's preferences, I see a challenge in two ways. One is that preferences might not differ regionally, but generational. Yeah, let's take the example that older people might have more short-term preferences and younger generation more long-term preferences. Let's look at the debate of climate protection. And the second challenge, that people might leave according to their, or might move according to their preferences. So you mentioned East and West Germany, So if you would ask preferences for employment in East Germany, let's say in the 90s, I would raise the hypothesis that people who have strong preferences for employment migrated, and those who stayed have lower preferences for employment, and they were tolerating social benefits as a compensation. Is there any way to control or for to control for such unobserved omitted variables, if that's the correct term?
Sure. I think I was not super clear about that. For instance, I mean, I can go back if you want, that in the life satisfaction regression, of course, there is control variables that might capture exactly what you're referring to. But while I agree with your examples, this might be reasons for a policymaker to say that are reasons for me not to use preferences and to use something else, but then the policymaker has to come up with a theory where that something else comes from, right? And I think that might be a bit challenging. And of course, if preferences are different across different generations or across different regions, some philosophers, okay, preferentialist philosophers have argued it's a matter of respect for people to respect their preferences about what they want in life. Now, you might immediately argue, yeah, but Koen, now you're a bit naive. Of course, we know, I mean, from sociological studies that preferences are formed. They're not, I mean, I'm not forming my preferences in my head in isolation, and my preferences might not be well informed. My preferences might be biased because I'm like the horse in the fair who only knows walking tours in the fair, and I've never walked in the what a bad metaphor, but you see what I wanted to say, that where I have lived might have been shaping my preferences. If that is the way you want to go, you might want to say, look, maybe we need a fourth generation of studies in which we want to control for some endogenous preference how preferences are formed for preference formation, and then we want to take out some controls. For instance, we might say that these preferences in Eastern Germany that are not well informed preferences, and we might want to control that if we have a good theory on how preferences were formed by this setting in which people were living. And I think that in fact is also the next step in the research agenda, but so far, we haven't been very successful in seeking funding for such a big collaborative project. But that is, in fact, where we see this research agenda going to. So to merge this literature with literatures on preference formation, and then the hard ethical choices about what are exactly the preferences, or how far you want to go by controlling, by laundering preferences, if you want, before we use them in normative theory. Because, I mean, your examples were very generous and very polite, but you could say, Koen, poor people have a preference for eating hamburgers. Is that what you want to respect? And then you might say, yeah, then I might argue, yeah, but these are maybe not well-informed preferences. And then I have to come with a theory on how to clean preferences for bad information. And we are not there yet. But again, it's ongoing work, and it's,
Thanks a lot, Koen. We have a question from Stefan. Stefan, granted.
Yes, can you hear me?
yes.
Yeah, fine. Yes, I find it also very inspiring. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Your term equivalent income reminded me of something else that is quite related to it. We have this equivalent compensation in income you need following price changes. We have the equivalence scales that were heavily researched on in the late 70s, 80s and following, and very interesting concepts. And I was wondering, and what they basically do is how much compensation would you need if instead of being a one-person household, you have a child, for example, or how much would you be paying So what is the difference in utility, not in terms of what a child costs, but a difference in utility if your socio-demographic profile differs from another one? And from these equivalence scales, which were being used for social benefit computation and so in many countries, they could somehow, I was wondering whether the good thing is you only need consumption and income data for that, or you need data on total budget and on what they spend on different commodities. And you do not need to ask people how they value being a four-person household or something like that. And I was wondering whether this could be transferred on your question. Let's say the equivalence, the additional payment, if you just ask people, what is your health status, or that you can categorize that, or also the status on social relations. You do not have to ask them how they value that. From their response in goods choices, you can somehow derive in a mathematical way how much the value of different levels of, in the old days it was socio-demographic profiles, and in your question it could be different non-income utility factors. Is that clear what I mean?
It's very clear, and I thank you very much for raising this point, because when I was this morning looking at my slides and thinking what should I certainly highlight, then I thought I should highlight the difference between equivalent incomes and equivalized incomes, and why equivalent income is a very bad name for what we're doing, because people are always confused and will think, but that's income after correcting for an equivalent scale. So why do we call it equivalent income? Because Samuelson called it an equivalent income a long time ago. In fact, it's the same thing, right? I mean, what you are talking about would be on the horizontal axis, different household compositions, and how we typically use an equivalent scale would be the equivalent income as a single. Now, you need quite some heavy assumptions. If you see it in that framework, you need some quite heavy assumptions to go to a uniform equivalent scale, right? Because you're assuming that the willingness to pay, in my terms, for having not being a single are the same across all households, which is an assumption we happily make if we think about equivalent scales, which of course we all know it's a ridiculous assumption if you think about it. We also need to assume that this is a multiplicative factor, right? That somehow this is the right, let's say, mathematical formula. So there's a lot of assumptions that go in equivalent scales to get to an equivalent scale, which is just a ratio. And if you're willing to make these assumptions, I mean, you're correct that what we are doing would just be an equivalent scale for health. Of course, the beauty of the old equivalent scale literature, that it is in fact, but it echoes what I was talking about. The Leiden approach, the subjective approach to equivalent scales, is very, very, very related to my life satisfaction regressions that I was talking about. The Deaton style demand estimation is very much would be the revealed preference analog of what I'm talking about here. Again, all the beauty of using just consumption data is, of course, that you can make the assumption that behavior reveals preferences. And this might be true if you are interested in different consumption patterns across different household types, but might be less true if you think about health. So I don't think that by just having consumption data and behavioral data, right, we can get to, with some parametric assumptions on indifference maps, we might get there. That's why I think I'm so much in the pleading for a stated preference approach.
Okay.
Am I somehow answering? I mean, I'm also very happy to follow up bilaterally. But thanks for your question. I agree very much. That is a very relevant question.
Thank you.
Okay, Thanks a lot, Koen. It looks like I'm going to hold you a little longer because we have a few more questions. Kelsey, granted.
Yes, thank you. Koen, I have what might be a stupid question or maybe a spicy question. So I'm wondering, if willingness to pay is in fact interpersonally comparable. And I'm thinking, subjective well-being is a latent concept that we, have to put into a measured scale. But your willingness to pay also depends upon preference maps that are difficult to elicit, as we're seeing. And you can think of them as being latent as well. And often, we, as part of what was pointed out, people have different preferences for very, very different reasons. And I think that there's some challenges with the revealed or stated preferences that might be more significant, which is, people have a difficult time predicting their subjective well-being in different instances anyway. But with revealed or stated preferences, people don't know what it's like to be in perfect health, or if they're in a pretty low quality health situation, they might value it more also because they have a broader range in which of experience, and then they may, so they're going to, within a person, their preferences are going to vary depending on their circumstances, which can change over time. And then also across people, you're ultimately translating a latent concept into something that we are then comparing across people.
It's very cheeky to call that a simple question.
Sorry, I didn't say simple. What I meant to say is stupid. Stupid or...
No, that's a very good point. So let me translate your point by saying, Koen, in fact, my indifference map in my actual bundle is in fact not the same indifference map as the map I would have in perfect health. The indifference curves might cross. I think that is absolutely, that's a very good point. That might be true, that there might be endowment effects, right? That, as that is sometimes called. But then maybe an intrapersonal comparison of Koen in two situations starts looking very much like an intrapersonal comparison start looking like an interpersonal comparison. And the tools we are using to compare you and me might be in fact the tools that we may want to use for me with my preferences in my actual bundle versus with me with my different preferences in my perfect health bundle. But you might also say this is a conceptual challenge, is that people just do not know what their preferences in counterfactual situations are. And then this either might be the end of this research line in which you say maybe it is theoretically attractive to use preferences, but preferences cannot be used in this way. And I think that when I was visiting in print and I talked with Angus Deaton, that would be more or less his line of thought, I would say. I think I'm a bit more optimistic, and I would say, no, it's rather we have to understand better how preferences depend on this endowment. And then in line with what I was responding to Stefan as well, that we could think of models in how to model the relation between the endowment and then correct for that. But you're absolutely right that are the deep challenges.
We can triangulate responses and take multiple approaches and get at this ultimate.
Yes. And in fact, that is in fact one of the reasons why we are also so keen on moving to a setting where people have incomplete preferences. So for this, you could argue that what you were describing, this endowment effect, is something like in behavioral economics would be different frames. And then you could say, Koen, I'm only considering that part of the preferences which do not depend on these frames or on these endowments. And then you will have incomplete preferences. And then how to deal with that is more or less what we try to address or are trying to address in our third generation set of studies. So that was in fact one of the motivations to move into an incomplete preference setting, even though that complicates things very much.
All right. Thanks a lot, Koen. Would you allow me to hold you still a little longer for maybe two more questions?
Of course. I came all the way. I was going to say that.
Thanks a lot. I would like to ask the audience to keep the questions as short as possible so
Also
that
me to
we have more
respond.
time to
Yeah.
discuss. We have a question from Ayola. Granted, Ayola.
I think it was Daniela Johnson. It wasn't me.
I'm sorry, Daniela? Yes, I have
I
a
think
question.
so, yeah. I think it was her.
Daniela is just gone. She had left the text in.
Okay, if that's the case, then I see a hand from Dr. Antje. Granted.
Yeah, so I have a very short question actually, and it's more practical concerning your survey. When you asked the respondents and you were there issues with inconsistent responses from the respondents? So were they, you know, like in one scenario they said, I don't know, I really don't know what to say, and then in the next one they said, I prefer this, and it wasn't inconsistent or not logical or whatever. Did you have issues with that? And if so, what did you do?
So it's indeed is a methodological interesting question to see. I mean, are people transitive, for instance? Are they? And this kind of things, we have a section on that in the paper in which we propose the ABDC method. And because the ABDC method relies on a couple of assumptions for it to work. Transitivity is one, monotonicity is another one. And we test that a little bit. I would say that I'm mildly optimistic, for instance, on the assumption of transitivity in this kind of settings. That of course people make mistakes. That's obvious, but there are no huge. Well, I was quite, let's say, positively surprised, but that's of course is also what you want to read into the data. But we have studied that a little bit. If you're interested, I mean. Trying to test as far as we can go with our quite flexible non-parametric method, for instance, also to test some standard parametric assumptions and this kind of things.
Okay.
I don't think that is a fully satisfactory answer, but it's also part of the research agenda.
Okay, cool.
Is to try to understand also under which of the methods that, for instance, because of course in the life satisfaction approach, I think it's almost by definition, you assume a parametric structure and you basically assume everything away. You push it in the error term. It might also be an advantage of of such a parametric approach, right? Compared to the ABDC, in which you don't have a parametric, in which you don't have an error term.
Yeah. Maybe we can continue talking about that because we are also going to conduct surveys, so we might have the same issue. Thank you.
Let me give you just one anecdote, and I'm messing up your timing. But I did a very similar experiment with my Belgian students, and I did exactly the same thing with my students when I was visiting Mark with some students in Princeton. And I can tell you that, I mean, I was not believing it myself and I saw the results, but the students in Princeton, they are super consistent. In fact, in a group of 100 students, I could not catch one guy who was not transitive. Whereas among my Belgian students, about, I think 10% of the students, where I could not reject that they, like a monkey, were just random picking responses. So that's one of the tests that we do. So would we be able to find different results compared to just random response behavior?
Do you think that's a measure of nationality or level of university?
Or economists, or asking economists?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
No, I think the group was very similar. No, it's either pure, I think it's a matter of coincidence, and also the environment is very different. I mean, I've been teaching in both environments, and yeah, there is much more. The performance and the stress involved in Princeton was much higher, and of course the selection effect. I mean, yeah.
Okay.
It's a very selective sample from 18-year-olds compared to Belgium, where it's much less selective. I can tell you that now that I'm correcting first-year exams. So.
All right. Thanks a lot, Koen. We have a kind request from Stefan. Could you please post the reference you were showing on the ABCD method or for example, have it saturated by Daria? This is to you, Koen. Could you please post the reference you were showing on the ABCD method?
Oh,
or
sure, yes.
Yeah.
So I can show you immediately, so you can take. This is a. So this is a paper in which we use the ABDC method, and the one with Santi, unfortunately, is almost a working paper. So will be posted on my webpage very soon. I hope later this summer as a working paper, but we still need to fix a couple of things. That's the one in which we compare the different methods that I was showing you at the end with the box plots. The paper with Annemie here is the one in which we propose the ABDC method.
Yes, and on that very note, Koen, I have a kind request still from Antje, or a question to you, that would you be able to share the slides?
Of course, of course.
Much obliged. So since I do not see so many other questions from our audience, and I think it's about time that we end the session. Maybe Koen, you have a parting shot, if you like.
No, I wanted to thank you for the very inspiring discussion and the questions, and I'm really looking forward to what your project is going to bring to the common knowledge about well-being.
We too.
Yes.
Can
imagine.
Yes. Thank you so much, Koen, for this captivating presentation. We at RuWell are really very much obliged to you for accepting to share your knowledge with us. And we believe that our audience very much liked the presentation and really learned a lot from this. Thank you so much. And we look forward to maintaining the connection with you and perhaps meeting you at the next available opportunity, either as a team or individually. We thank you so much. And if there is no other thing, then I'll request that we end the session here. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Let's stay in touch.